tracking progress on those goals super easy. Like, it's so hard to do. But what if you could just use a robot to keep you accountable and be like, hey, this was a goal. What's the progress? What new items are you going to do this week to get closer? And that's how we've built Agilow, with the spirit of keeping you on track, the spirit of helping you set goals. And that's how we are helping our clients.
Yes. Hi, Shiv. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm good, Kaori. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to do this podcast with you.
The reason why I could interview Shiv today is I attended your demo day last week, right?
Yeah, so I'm currently part of the Jackson Square Ventures, summer accelerator, along with 6 other startups, which just got completed last week, and we had a demo day, and Kaori was there.
So could you please quick introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Shiv Panjwani. I'm an Indian citizen, an aerospace engineer who's now building an agile software company based out of Carnegie Mellon, where I'm currently an MBA student. I'm in the middle of my MBA. I still have 1 more year to go. But in Carnegie Mellon, we have the SWAT Center for Entrepreneurship, and our company is based out of that incubator.
What is the Agilow?
Yeah, absolutely. So Agilow, actually, the meaning is in the name. It's a combination of Agile and Maslow. And so we really believe that work and career is a place where people can grow and become the best version of themselves. We want everyone to go into work on a Monday morning and be really excited about the work they're doing, kind of like a sportsman, right? When they go into work, they get to do what they love doing, which is play sports. They get to enjoy and they get to grow. And that's how I see work. Any work, whether that's a low-level job, even something like a warehouse employee or a blue-collar worker, all the way to white-collar workers, everyone should go to work and feel like they have a sense of growth. And that's Maslow, right? Being the best version of themselves is on top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we see Agile as a way to achieve that, as a way to create a culture of continuous improvement while maintaining business execution, so that both the company and the employees can grow at the same time. And that's why we chose the name Agilow. Yeah, and that's what Agile is about.
I love that. Totally agree with you, because of work is not only like making money, like we want to grow thanks to through the work, like communicate with other people or getting new skill. So please tell us, who is the main target?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now we work with early stage startups who've kind of passed the accelerator stage, kind of like us. Exactly. We're trying to solve a very personal problem too. When you're in a startup, you're surrounded by advisors, you have events, you have someone to keep you accountable. But once you pass the accelerator stage, now you have funding. But oftentimes young founders don't have management experience in terms of how to run effective stand-ups, effective retros, how to plan goals, in a structured format, create urgency in the team. And so those are the people we help with. We work with accelerator directors directly who make introduction to their promising startups, who have young founders, they have a problem they want to solve, but they just lack that management structure and education. So we help those founders move towards their goals even faster with a structure.
Yeah, this is good. By the way, so I also worked as the Y Combinator startup and also Japanese startup as a product designer, product manager. Yeah. And at that time, we used, I forgot, Jira. And also, as a Japanese company, we used Asana. Okay. And for me, I don't know, I am not the engineer. That's why I enjoyed to use Asana.
You enjoyed Asana? Okay, that's good.
Somehow I felt intuitive than Jira.
Yeah.
But so in order to communicate with the other team, we use other software, Slack. Where did we chat? Jira, Asana, or Slack, or Gmail? I had to search and then taking time.
Yeah. No, exactly. So we love these project management tools. All of them, they all have good intention. They want to help us visualize our work, structure our work, but basically create an agent who sits on top of these tools, and you can just talk to the agent and be like, I have to tell Shiv, I have to like organize a podcast with Shiv. These are the points I want to talk about. Just assign Shiv this task and then send him an email, right? And it can do that with your voice, right? And natural language. So instead of like trying to find tools and create it yourself, you can just talk to the agent on your mobile and get that work done. So that's what we are building essentially. We integrate with Asana, Jira, Trello, Notion, and now even Slack soon. And basically we keep, this is the tool, this is you, and this is a robot, an agent.
I see.
And you just talk to the agent, and the agent makes all the changes on the board. Yeah, and then go create tickets in Jira. If engineers are using Jira, then Jira. If the marketing is using Asana, then Asana. And Agilow already knows that because he knows the members on the Asana board, so he knows who all are where. And he, she, or it, whatever you want to call Agilow, it's yours. And yeah, it'll automatically assign the tickets. And today it's on a phone, but tomorrow it'll be like Ray-Ban, it'll be Umi, and so then you just talk and the work can be assigned. Because you're right, like usually if you want to communicate to 3-4 different people, you have to go create tickets and then assign, and then someone else and then assign, or do a phone call or do a Slack. It's just so time consuming just to transfer information. What if you could talk to one robot who knew all the others and they could go and transfer that information for you? Even better for the receiving party. Like if you call them, it's convenient to your time. They might be busy right at that time.
Yeah.
So Agilow can make sure by monitoring their backlog that when is the right time to disturb them with this piece of work. Like where do I fit it in their priorities? If you're the boss, you can be like, this is urgent, right? Then Agilow will be like, okay, hey Shiv, like you got to stop and you got to listen to this ticket for a second because it seems to be urgent. But if it's not that urgent, if it's something you want an answer for, when I'm taking a break, I can tell Agilow, okay, I finished this task, and Agilow can be like, well, Kyori is waiting for this question, you want to answer it? So yeah, just like a personal assistant or a management assistant in between the whole team. Yeah.
It's amazing. Okay, so how did you come up with this idea?
Yeah, so when I was a Agile coach, like right before this, I came into my MBA like with an idea of making an Agile coaching company, and very human based, right? And part of that was creating Kanban boards or Scrum boards for my clients, and I had to manage like tickets for all of them, right? And I was good at it, but it was just very tedious. And my clients, like they used to watch me make Jira tickets and get bored. And I'm like, and at the same time, note takers were coming out, like Otto, right, Firefly. And I'm like, okay, so if note takers can create information, like why can't we, instead of having a separate summary document, why can't we just directly create tickets and manage backlogs the way we today? Like, why do we have to create this new separate document, right? So then I'm like, okay, then I start with a prototype. I started with Notion and made a voice automation for Notion. And the first time I saw it, I'm like, whoa, this is amazing that you can do this. And that's how the idea came, is to make management easier, make visualization easier. If you worked in an engineering team, you'll know that engineers do not like updating Jira tickets. It's very boring. So now we've made it super easy, where even if you're on your desktop, you can just click an icon, Agilow will come up, you speak, or you just type a few words, and then it updates the Jira board without you ever having to go to Jira itself. So yeah, that's how the idea came, is to make visualization super easy and make updating tickets like super easy. Yeah.
Amazing. Super cool. Okay. Do you have your paid customer?
Yeah, so we have two paid customers. We only started 7 weeks ago, but we already have 2 of our first customers. It's again, both are AI startups, like well funded. And that's, I think the biggest pain point we solve is how to make setting goals easier and how to make tracking progress on those goals super easy. Like, it's so hard to do. But what if you could just use a robot to keep you accountable and be like, hey, this was a goal. What's the progress? What new items are you going to do this week to get closer? And that's how we've built Agilow, with the spirit of keeping you on track, spirit of helping you set goals. And that's how we are helping our clients. We call ourselves the business coach for like a sports team, right? So I'm so sporty. I've even done agile transformations for a sports team, and I've seen the effect. But that's what Agilow is. It helps you set whatever goal you want. The first client web is you. They want to be on product hunt, right? Like we want to be in October. So we help them break it down. Okay, you want to be in product hunt in 3 months. What are the different things you need in terms of product, in terms of marketing, in terms of sales or demo calls? And they talk. We just listen and structure their conversation, and then give them, okay, these are the 3 goals that you've set. And we use different kind of management frameworks, and that's what Agilow has been prompted with, basically, because we are consultants, right? And MBA students, we know frameworks like MECE, mutually exclusive, completely exhaustive. We know the rule of 3. We know SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relatable, and timeline. Yeah. So we have prompted Agilow and tuned it to be a management coach who can help listen to your conversations, create goals for you, and help you measure progress.
If you can say the strengths of Agilow or kind of differentiation than other competitors.
Our competitors give you an empty platform. We ask good questions, right? So like I said, many new upcoming founders, they don't know how to manage projects, but they have a note taker. Okay, but we educate the founders on what kind of questions to ask. So we facilitate meetings. We don't just take notes of the meetings. And I think that's the biggest differentiator from us and a note taker, is we actually educate on you on how much time you should spend on this meeting, what's the agenda for this meeting, and then we automatically integrate actionable steps into your direct project management tool, whether that's Asana, Notion, Jira, Trello, rather than giving you this document of summary and generic action items. So I think, that's the core difference, is that we educate and integrate into existing apps as opposed to taking notes.
I see. Thank you. So now your service, Agilow's service, is monthly subscription service.
Yeah, correct. It's a monthly subscription service. It's only a platform right now, so we've made it super cheap. It's $19.99, $20 per month per user. And that's about it for your team, and that's how we sell it. Before it was consulting, so it was $200 or $250 per user, which was still a very good deal compared to hiring an executive coach. But we wanted to make it even cheaper so that everyone can have good project management, and so that's why it's only $20 per user now. Yeah.
The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Shiv, part 1. 1. Agilow equal Agile plus Maslow. Work as growth, not just execution. Shiv built Agilow around the idea that work should be a place for personal growth, not just productivity. Inspired by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the vision is that every worker, from warehouse employees to engineers, should feel they are becoming the best version of themselves through the job. Example, like a sport team that improve every game. Agilow helps startups create a culture of continuous improvement, where both the company and the employee grow together. 2. An AI agent that removes management friction. Agilow is not just another project management tool. Instead, as an AI assistant that sits on top of Jira, Asana, Notion, Trello, and Slack. So founders and teams can simply talk to the agent in natural language. Example, wasting time creating multiple tasks in Jira for engineers and separate tasks in Asana for marketing. You can say, assign this project to engineer A and marketing B and notify them. And Agilow updates the right tools automatically. It even considers urgency and team members' workload before assigning tasks. 3. Early traction, paid customers, and rapid impact. Although only launched 7 weeks ago, Agilow already has 2 paying customers, both AI-driven web startups. The tool has helped them structure goals, track progress, and even transform team onboarding. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give your like. The next episode is the conversation with Shiv part 2. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。